You already know what it is. We're back with another Behind the Builds. It's your boy, Ryan D is ZZP, and I got
Turbo Tim is ZZP.
Hype up the energy, boys. Today we're talking about pros and cons of big turbos versus small ones.
I love this subject. There's so much to think about when choosing a turbo.
100%.
Like, for example, your best stories of racing people are on one of the smallest turbos your Cobalt has ever had.
Oh yeah, 100%. So we have a lot of you guys out here that this is like a lot of our platform cars are your first turbo cars. For instance, a lot of our Sonic customers, a lot of our ATS customers, even a lot of our LNF customers, like this is a stock first turbo car. You've never experienced or had NA cars before, or even blower cars before. So me and Tim today are gonna kind of talk about the pros and cons of having it all. So, because there's a balance to all this.
There is a balance. Like, there are pros and cons to everything. There are pros and cons to your stock turbo. Mm-hmm. There are pros and cons to an upgraded medium-sized turbo. There are pros and cons to a large turbo.
Absolutely.
And you have to pick the correct one for your car and your driving style.
Absolutely. I know you guys have heard us on our podcast talk many times about choosing the right size turbo for you. So let's talk about the basics first. Number one, most of your factory vehicles, GM or factory engineers want people to have throttle response and make that power pretty much instantly so you can pull out in traffic, drive in many numerous conditions, not be at a point where you are not going to have power.
We have either a 1.4 or a 2-liter engine. Mm-hmm. That's a little engine, and we want to make like big power out of that engine. Mm-hmm. The only way to do that is to boost it. Yeah. And obviously you don't want to give up power to driving a supercharger. So with the turbo, you don't have that. So that means you have to run a larger turbo. It is impossible to make 600 horsepower and have it still spool quickly.
And that's a great point I want to talk about first. So guys, smaller turbos like your factory KO4s, TD04s, the Sonic, I forget the name of that specific Sonic one, real tiny donut on that one. So guys, usually physically you have a few trade-offs. A pro about a stock size turbo or a small turbo is you get a lot of spool really quickly, which usually leads to a lot of torque. The downside of that is, here's the con to that, as the RPMs raise, where a 4-cylinder really wants to make power in the higher RPMs, or even a 6-cylinder, even sometimes a V8 car, if the turbo is really good at spooling down low, you're usually not gonna get the flow on the upside. For instance, on a KO4 turbo, like on the LNF, usually you run out of power in the 5,000 RPM, between 5,000 and 5,500 RPM range. So that is where you get your instant torque spike and you're moving out, you've got a great power band, but then in the higher RPMs, it feels like it doesn't keep pulling.
And the reason why is because the engine is starting to get efficient and it's starting to flow, and that turbo is not able to keep that boost up. Let's say your boost is set to 25 PSI. Let's say you can hit 25 PSI at 2,500 RPM or something. It's not gonna hold 25 PSI at 6,500.
It's gonna bleed off.
It's gonna fall off because that engine starts to flow, and as that engine flows, boost drops.
Yes, exactly. So, a lot of people will come to us saying, I want it to spool like KO4, but I want to make 500 horsepower. Well, guys, if it was possible, GM would have that turbo on the car right from the factory, ready to go. Because if you can make all the power and have it flow a lot, that's literally the perfect turbo. But then you get into cons of going to a larger turbo. You guys want to make 100 horsepower over stock, 50 horsepower over stock, etc. 50 horsepower above tuning on your stock turbo and the like. So this is where you get into the points of a larger turbo.
Larger turbos have larger passages that flow through them and larger wheels. Larger wheels are heavier. So now you have the same amount of engine flowing through this turbo, and you're trying to spin a bigger wheel through a bigger passage. That's where lag comes in. Obviously there's a lot of tuning stuff you can do to help with lag, but I mean, besides like anti-lag and like power braking at the line, like you're gonna have some lag.
There's always drawbacks to it, so that's why, kind of going back to our earlier point, you can't have a really small turbo make a lot of power. You can't have a really large turbo make a lot of power down low. But something that we like to remind people at ZZP here, you should very rarely be out of the turbo power band. In most cases of racing, if you have to drag strip, yes, at the line you will be out of the turbo's power band because you have to get all that inertia spool. You got to get those wheels moving. You got to get it allowed to make all this boost pressure to put into your charge pipes, your intercooler, and right to your engine. So that's why Tim was mentioning the anti-lag or the two-step, and that's where that stuff kind of comes in. But again, when you're like roll racing or, you know, pulling out in the traffic at 3,000, 4,000 RPM, if your turbo is sized appropriately, you're gonna be essentially in power band.
Yes, like depending on the car you have, is going to depend on what turbo you need to run. For example, if you have a manual transmission car, keep in mind, you have full control over when that vehicle moves. You just rev it higher before you let the clutch out. If you have an auto, you can't. It requires power and flow to spool that turbo. So if you put a gigantic turbo on your auto car, I'm not gonna be specific because we have so many platforms, but you put a large turbo for the platform on your car and you have an auto, it is very possible you're not gonna be able to build any boost at the line. It's very possible you could build a car that like you have to worry as you're pulling out into traffic because it takes 100 feet for it to get moving. You might have to power brake it a little bit to simply pull out into traffic. There are times with certain vehicles that you need to choose a smaller turbo. And keep in mind, you spend 99% of the time spooling your turbo, taking off, accelerating in traffic. Like you spend a very small amount of time actually at full throttle.
Yes, that's a very good point. Going back to something I want to key in on what Tim just said, choosing the right size turbo for your application. Again, we see the videos of the 1,000 horsepower Evos and the 1,500 horsepower Supras and all this other stuff. You guys have to remember, a lot of those cars are set up very particular too. The biggest possible turbo isn't always the answer. For instance, if you are road coursing or we'll use autocross, if you are autocrossing your car when it's a very tight turns, low speed kind of stuff, choosing a 57 millimeter turbo for your four cylinder may not be the answer. Especially if you can't keep the RPMs up like that.
Yeah, like when I went to Tail of the Dragon, I bring my Sonic to Tail of the Dragon with the Z04. There are a couple turns to where it's like, I've got to grab the next lower gear because it takes too long to spool it. Like in a tight autocross type situation or road race or short like track situation, my Sonic might be better suited to have a V3 turbo. Tail of the Dragon is so many turns in such a short distance that I'm not utilizing my Z04 there.
Yes, correct.
But if I go to a road course like Road Atlanta or Road America or something like that, Gingerman, like I'm gonna want the Z04 or larger.
Exactly, so that's something that we are always preaching here about choosing the right turbo for your application. So a few of the pros about going into a big turbo setup, one of the big things that Tim sees as being a remote tuner and seeing all these logs and stuff is cooler intake air temperatures and cooler overall running.
I'm gonna make up a boost number just to make the point. Not all 20 PSI of boost is the same power. You should never say I want 20 pounds of boost, let's say, because 20 pounds of boost through the stock turbo is not the same as 20 pounds of boost through a large turbo. A large turbo is going to have a cooler, denser air charge. So you are moving more airflow per PSI. So like, please keep that in mind. Great pro to a large turbo is less exhaust pressure.
That's huge, especially for you 1.4 guys. Even on the LTG guys, it's really huge.
Yes, it gets the exhaust heat out of there. Is easier on the exhaust valve springs. It is easier on exhaust valves. It makes your tuner like you. Like having a larger turbo tunes so much better than trying to tune a max effort stock turbo car.
Hey guys, we're gonna talk about a few cons real quick if we're going to a bigger turbo.
If you have a manual tranny car and you have a very large turbo, you can easily lose a race in just driving style. I mean, you know what? It applies to auto guys too. Like for an auto guy, if you're gonna roll race somebody, you're gonna have to find a way to power brake the car and maybe add some kind of anti-lag button to like build boost while maintaining a steady speed.
Yeah.
Kind of the same for a manual tranny, but then a manual tranny adds one more difficult part to it, the shifting. So let's say you have a large turbo on your manual tranny car and you build your boost and you're ready to go. As soon as you go to shift, if you are not no-lift shifting this car, and a lot of our cars can't handle no-lift shifting. Some of them can, some of them cannot, you F-35 guys.
No lift at your own risk, everybody. And I know Tim's seen it on the logs, and this is not a diss to anybody, but a lot of you guys will actually floor your cars the whole way.
Yeah.
So like if your throttle, if you are not to the floor, you're gonna feel like your car is slower, or even stoplight to stoplight. If some guy rolls up next to you at a stoplight and you're just trying to quickly get on it versus like a 5.0 Mustang or so, NA car or something, you're very likely to lose the race if you're not prepared and ready to go. It's a big part of a kind of a larger turbo is you have to be prepared. You have to be ready to go when you're trying to race somebody.
Let's say you're at a traffic light and somebody revs at you and you're like, oh, I'm gonna go. If you're in a stock turbo or like a small stock turbo upgrade, like the light can go green and you can just floor it and take off.
Yeah.
If you have a large turbo, there's a lot of prep work here.
Oh yeah.
There's like the proper brake boosting per the pavement that you're on, per the tires you have on the car. Like you're gonna need to know for every pavement and weather condition what RPM you power brake to where you can take off and not either, have a ton of lag or blow the tires off and lose a race.
Absolutely. So there is a few cons to doing this. It takes a lot more prep time, and then obviously with the newer cars, you gotta make sure your traction control is off, because like Sonic and ATS guys, I'm kind of calling, and even LNF guys, I'm calling you out, because if you try to power brake, or for your auto HHR guys, or you try to launch it really hard and then you try to shift quickly, your car's gonna see a lot of torque and it's gonna be like, whoa, let's hold on here. It's gonna kind of hold you back, and that could be a car and a half that you're gonna be a little embarrassed about by losing to this stock turbo Mini Cooper or something like that.
Yep.
So
another pro is with a large turbo, it usually doesn't hit as hard. So from like a roll race, sometimes it works to your advantage.
Oh yeah.
Sometimes the power comes in as your traction is available as well.
Sometimes. So if it has all season tires on your car and you're in the winter and you're in the cooler weather in the early morning sometime, it's not gonna matter if you have a stock turbo or you have a big turbo, you're gonna spin the tires, and that's a bad time because you're making a lot more power with a larger turbo too.
Yeah, I know this is not a tire talk, but he brings up a very good point. Like you have to have the appropriate tire for the conditions. If you're driving in less than 40-degree temps, you're gonna need an all-season, you're gonna need a winter tire, let's say if you're in snow. But if you're in warm temps and you have a high-performance car, you need a high-performance tire. And I don't mean a high-performance all-season, I mean a high-performance summer tire.
Tires.
Like, I can't count the amount of times I see people that wanna build this wild car but refuse to have 2 sets of wheels and tires for it.
Which you need.
At some point, you just have to have 2 sets. Like, and really, like if it's an all-season vehicle, you might need 3.
Yeah.
You might need your snow tires for snow season. You might need your all-season for your mid-season, and then you might need your summer like 200 tread wear for like the peak of summertime, because all those tires like have their they're all useful in the right time.
Absolutely. So there is a lot that kind of goes into choosing whether you want to go to a bigger turbo or stay on your stock turbo. And there are a lot of big wheel upgrades that keep the stock housings. So just know whatever you're deciding to do is kind of what you should choose your turbo for. A lot of people just want to make big numbers, which is fine, and that's kind of what we are here to assist you with. But if you email any of us in customer service, or Tim, or when he's tuning you or anything like that, we will all ask you, what is it that you want to do with your car? If you say I want to do autocross, but I want to make 500 horsepower, we're going to say, well, you may not be able to do both of those.
Yeah, you can't do both at all times.
Yes.
You can choose something that can do both fairly well, or you choose one that only does what you want to do.
Correct.
There are so many times that you want to do 2 things with the car and your turbo doesn't do both.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to have to decide where are you going to sacrifice? Are you going to sacrifice drag racing for your autocross.
So obviously there are things you can do to mitigate, you know, the cons of a larger turbo as well.
Yeah,
like
there are mods.
Yeah.
There are mods that will help larger turbos. Like for example, valve springs lets you rev the car out. Obviously, if you add a larger turbo, it generally adds power band onto the top based on what we said earlier. So adding valve springs gives you more RPM, which gives you more power band. Then there are also cams. Cams can allow you to spool the turbo better, as well as improve the flow of the engine in the higher RPMs.
Yeah, for the VVT guys like our Sonics, our LTGs, our LNFs, our tuners know how to make your turbo spool better by changing the cam tables.
Yeah, there are adjustments in the cam tables that can make the engine spool 500 to 700 RPM quicker. And for drag racing guys, like we even have drag race files that like there are tricks in the ECM that it's usually like a drag only file because you don't want to daily drive with the drag file because you'll run into the holes of tweaks we make and it'll run funny. But yeah, we can make a drag only file that makes the car launch better.
Absolutely.
Mods like cold air intake, mods like intercooler, mods like exhaust are always beneficial for stock turbos. However, with a larger turbo, they're more important.
Oh yeah.
The more flow you have, the more flow you need. So you need a freer flowing intake, you need an intercooler to cool that hot boost down. Now an intercooler works probably equally great for the stock and the aftermarket turbo. Number one, an intercooler cools that hot air. When you compress that air, it makes it hot. You gotta cool it back down. Cool air is denser, more power. From the factory, the stock intercooler on the newer, later model cars usually is after the AC condenser.
Yeah.
Keep in mind your AC condenser has been taking rocks, bugs, like all kinds of road debris for the last X tens of thousands of miles. So all of our ZZP intercoolers are relocated in front, so it gets fresh, cool air, and that's crucial. So the stock turbo puts out way hotter air than a larger turbo, but it puts out less, so it's beneficial. A large turbo moves a lot more air, but it's a little less hot, so it's still very beneficial. And then next you need, let's say cams, and then valve springs, and then you move on down to the line, and next is exhaust.
Oh yeah.
You could run the stock exhaust on pretty much any car with a stock turbo.
Yeah.
Usually your gains are single-digit gains. However, if you put a large turbo on the car, you're going to see double-digit gains with exhaust.
Flow. It's all about the flow when it comes to that.
All about the flow.
So, someone in a caveat, I want to say to Tim's intercooler, bigger isn't always better.
Yeah.
So what we have kind of found at ZZPerformance is we kind of optimize the size of what you can fit within, you know, to get the amount of airflow to it and to, you know, not create a bunch of areas to fill air. Because guys, remember the intercooler is a cavity in your whole system. You have to fill all of that, which can increase lag if you go too big, because we see customers, I want to get the biggest intercooler possible because that's going to come cool the most. Yes, but you're also increasing the amount of volume that you have to get throughout your whole system, which could in turn increase the lag. So the biggest intercooler is not always the best option. A properly sized intercooler, like all the ones in our kits, are super, super important to get. Also too, with this can be looked as a pro or a con to a larger turbo, is depending on what your vehicle setup is, you may not be able to use a lot of the parts that you already have. For instance, on our V3 turbo for the Sonic, you can reuse your same downpipe, midpipe combo. You can reuse all your exhaust components. You can reuse all the other components on your vehicle. But for the Z04, which is a very amazing turbo, we all love that turbo, but it does give you a new downpipe and midpipe that comes with the kit. On your Cobalts and the likes, your downpipe on your LNF, like on the Z54 or Z57 or the Z series and the ZFR series turbos, you can reuse all your same downpipes and all your intakes and stuff. But if you go to a S257 or larger turbo, you have to change your intake, you gotta change your couplers, you gotta change your downpipe, you gotta go to an external wastegate. So there is
exhaust manifold.
Exhaust manifold, yes. Like your whole setup changes, you won't be able to reuse a lot of that other stuff. which is, it costs more to go to a too big of a turbo or a larger turbo to an extent. So make sure that you're looking at your whole budget when you are deciding when you are going to upgrade to a turbo, and knows that a lot of the money you spent in the past, you're gonna have to kind of redouble it, and you're gonna do it again, and and buy those same parts again. When you go to a T3, a turbo manifold, or have to change your downpipe out to a V-band downpipe versus your stock, bolt-on one that you've already purchased. So when we talk about, is it good for you to go to a larger turbo or not, or to mitigate which one you want to go with, just know, is it good for your setup and your budget and what you're actually going to be doing? Sometimes we'll get customers saying, hey, I want to make 400 horsepower and road courses. Like, oh, hey man, how often are you going on the road course? Maybe once a year, maybe. Like, but are you driving the car daily normally? Yeah, I drive it every day normally. Okay, well, there's a balance. Do you want the smaller turbo to be really good at road coursing or autocrossing, or do you want the large turbo to run around and beat your friends on the highway, or from digs and the like, or go to the drag strip more often? So again, I know we've harped on it a few times here, but let us know what you're trying to do, and we can help you choose the right turbo for your setup. It's not always about the peak numbers. Like sometimes bragging on the internet to your friends or whatever, saying how much horsepower you got, sometimes that's not the most important thing.
Sometimes the car is slower.
Yeah.
Yeah, you might dyno 50 more wheel horsepower than your buddy, but if your buddy's car spools 1,000 RPM sooner, like, you're probably gonna lose to him 9 times out of 10.
Yeah, unless
you're not gonna wanna do a 40 to 150 run to catch up to them.
Yeah.
Most of your races are a couple gears of full throttle.
Yeah.
Like, one thing I can say, like, if you default to the slightly smaller turbo, you might always have in the back of your mind you wanted the larger turbo, but you won't know how good of a choice you made.
Yeah, you really won't.
You won't know. You'll be like, oh, I wish I went larger, but then you don't know how awesome that smaller turbo is. But if you put too large of a turbo on the car, you're just gonna lose a lot of races.
Oh yeah. Making the peak numbers and bragging to your friends or bragging on the internet about how much horsepower you make, there's a sliding bar. Like, if you have all the stuff to spool it up really, really quickly to make that power band huge, sure, that can be great, but more times than not, having lower power to be able to drive the car and get a power band. Power band over peak numbers is what we really are trying to preach here. It is very, very important to properly choose your turbo. So again, if your stock turbo is doing what you want better, that's great. But if the big turbo, the bigger one than what you currently have, fits your setup more, not the biggest possible option, that's great. There is not all about making your peak numbers and having this for this much power band versus your buddies who have this much power band. All of this is where you're missing it. Again, power band, power band, power band. So guys, I hope that we've kind of talked to you and let you know a lot of pros and cons about doing a big turbo versus small turbo and really choosing the turbo that you want for your vehicle. If you guys do have any questions, please feel free to email customerservice@ZZPerformance.com. Again, hit that subscribe button, that like button, so we can make sure to keep making these videos for you, all these informative behind the build setups to help you guys really dial in your specific choices. If you have any questions, again, like I said, email us, ask us the questions, let us know what you want to do with the car, and either myself, Tim, Tyler, any of us here, we're all happy to help, and we'll make sure that you are happy with your build overall and that you will be able to drive it and have many more smiles per gallon. All right, guys, I think we're going to sign off for today. This is once again Ryan D at ZZP.
Turbo Tim at ZZP.
We'll see you next time.
Go fast, not broke.